So before I ask for questions, Jane's talk remind me of three stories, and one is about my own life. So a long time ago, I had this amazing therapist, and many of you have heard my stories about this amazing therapist. It was Gestalt therapy, and she was just absolutely fantastic. And at one point, she wanted me to rip up a phone book and say, she was from Prague, and she had this very thick accent. She wanted me to rip up a phone book and say, "I want." And I said, "Do you want me to say I want, or do you want me to say I won't?" And she said, "I want, I want." So I still don't know what she wanted me to say, but I thought it was interesting that I want and I won't kind of sound the same, you know? I thought that was kind of interesting. Another one is relating to what Jane said at the end. It's not just in stories people make up. So my father, when he was a child, he was born and lived until he was 14 in Russia. And when he was a small child, there was a terrible pogrom where he lived. So pogroms, for those who don't know, that's when the sort of uh, sort of bad guys would come through the town and kill Jews, basically. That's what they would do. They just kill Jews. And what happened is the men would hide because they'd kill the men. The women would probably, and children usually survived. And if they didn't find anybody, they'd search. So the women and children would sort of stay behind so that they wouldn't find the men and kill them. And so my grandmother and my father, as a small child, and her other children are in their home, and the Cossacks break in, and they're ready to just rampage and destroy and steal everything. And my grandmother looks at one of them and she says, "Oh, your hand is hurt. Let me wash it and bandage it for you." She actually did that. Like, what kind of presence of mind, you know? "Oh, your hand is hurt. Let me wash it and bandage it for you." And so she, washed his wound and bandaged him, and they all calmed down. And when she was done, she gave them tea or something, and then they said, "Well, we have to take your money, but here." And they gave her a lot back. You have to feed your family, so we'll just take your money and leave. So that's a wonderful story. But I don't want to give people the idea that every time you're selfless and your heart is open, and I don't know that she was selfless and her heart is open. She might have just been really clear, whoa, this is the way to save my family. But that things turn out okay, because the other one is one of my favorite Zen stories. It's about Zen Master Amdu, who at the end of his life, this was a time in late Tang Dynasty China where there were warlords and bandits and, horrible things, famines and, pandemics and everything going on. And sort of the death throes of the Tang, it took about 200 years. And anyway, so that's why the monasteries were up in the mountains, because it was harder to attack things up in the mountains. It was easier if they were down in the valleys. So, the warlord and his retinue come in, and the monks say, this guy's coming and we got to get out of here. And Amdu says, "I'm sick of this. I'm just sick of this. I'm just going to stay here." So he's sitting in front of the altar, like I'm sitting in front of this, calligraphy, and he's just sitting in front of the altar, and this warlord comes in with his retinue, and he says, "I could kill you." And, Amdu doesn't bat an eye. And so the guy does kill Amdu. See, it doesn't always turn out nice. He does kill Amdu. And Amdu's scream resonated for 20 li. That's a Chinese system of measurement, which I looked it up. It's about 6 miles. So imagine somebody screaming in Lawrence, Kansas, and you can hear it in Eudora. That's what it was like. And so Amdu screams, and the scream was very important because the story goes down through the centuries, and it eventually reaches Hakuin in Japan. And Hakuin's like, "Why am I practicing? Why am I practicing if at the end of my life, instead of dying in serenity, I scream, And this brought this big question to Hakuin, and he actually got sick from it. And it's a long story about how he got cured and everything. But this scream of Amdu is what made the great teacher Hakuin Hakuin, because he could find no one who could answer this question. It was like, if the purpose of Zen is to be happy, what am I doing here? That was sort of his question. And so it sent him on this great search, and that's why he became a great teacher. So those are three stories. And now I'll ask if there are any questions. So just speak up, and your picture should not appear, but your voice should.
I have a question about the chants.
Okay.
There were two chants this morning, and usually when I'm sitting, there's only the Kwanzaa Bosal. So, and I think it's been mentioned, but I don't remember uh, what the difference between the two chants are. And I take it both of them are parts of longer chants, from what I understand. So some explaining that would be helpful. Thank you.
Sure. So Kwanzaa Bosal, that's Kuan Yin, Avalokiteshvara. So when we do the Heart Sutra, the Heart Sutra is um, talking about or talking from, people differ, Avalokiteshvara. It's about Avalokiteshvara's practice. So that's the Bodhisattva of compassion. And Avalokiteshvara is male, and then Kuan Yin or Kuan Se, Quan Ji in something like Kwan Se in Korean, is the Bodhisattva of compassion, becomes female. And Kwan Se is interesting because it means perceive world sound. So the idea is, if you actually listen, if you're not trapped in your own want, won't, happy, unhappy, if you're not trapped there and you just pay attention, then you hear the sound of the world. And then what is the sound of the world? It's suffering. And then compassion awakes, and then you can help. And compassion is not like a feeling. It's not, oh, I feel compassionate today. That's not the idea. So compassion is action. So there's a chant we sing, the Thousand Eyes at Hand Sutra. That's Kuan Yin's thousand eyes, and in each hand there's a thousand hands, and in each hand, the center, there's an eye. So it's actually 1,002 eyes and 1,000 hands. So it's a Thousand Eyes and Hand Sutra. And you see statues where they actually manage to fit in like 1,000 hands, you know. And so that's, and yes, it's part of a slightly longer chant. There's an introduction and an end part, in which the end part is mostly mantras. And in the introduction is, homage to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, and then a little bit of other stuff. And then Jijang Bosal, so that's Ksitagarbha, and this is the Bodhisattva of transition. So Ksitagarbha or Jijang Bosal in Japan, it's Jizo. I forget what it is in China. So this is, and he's usually, it's definitely a he, and usually a monk with green hair carrying a staff with 6 rings. So that's the iconography of Jijang Bosal. And this is the Bodhisattva of transition, which in particular means dead people, travelers, small children, firefighters. I don't know why the firefighters get in there, but they do. So that's Jijang Bosal. And similar to Kwanzaa Bosal, the chant, there's a sort of introductory part, which is basically homage to Jijang Bosal, and then almost exactly the same mantras that are done for Kwanzaa Bosal. So we just take the little tiny part, because if you join us on Wednesday night, you can hear the whole chant, because we do the whole chant. We do the Kwanzaa Bosal chant, and then if, as today, we have a double thing, then we'll switch to the Jijang Bosal halfway through. So basically that's what those are. And the question is, what are these bodhisattvas? Where do these bodhisattvas live? Like, are they in the clouds somewhere? So when we chant to a bodhisattva, we're not asking the Bodhisattva as an external agent to do anything. What we're doing is we're awakening that Bodhisattva in ourselves. Because we are Kwanseum Boso, we are Jijang Boso, we are all the Buddhas and all the Bodhisattvas already. That's who we are. And so this chant is awakening this in ourselves and in solidarity with people who are ill or who have died. And it's a way of focusing our attention, just for a little bit, focusing our attention on the people we're chanting for. There's a practice in Judaism where when someone dies, for 11 months, you say, the mourners say Kaddish, the people who are close family-wise say this prayer called Kaddish, which has nothing to, it doesn't say anything about death, it's just praising God. And then in Buddhism, when someone you're close to dies, for 49 days you chant Jijang Bosal. And it's very interesting. So being both Jewish and Buddhist, I've done both. And it's very interesting doing that, because what happens is if you're mourning somebody, you sort of have this fixed object, this chant or this prayer that you're doing, and it doesn't change. You're just doing this, right? Usually like the same time every day, or, if it's Kaddish, you're doing it when you go to shul, and if it's Jijang Bosal, you're doing it every day at the same time. And what you do is you watch your mind change. So at first you're overcome by grief. Not always, but usually you're just kind of overcome by grief. And then after a while, the shape of that grief changes. And because you have this fixed object that you're remembering the person in this fixed activity every day, it sort of allows you to see what's happening in your mind and in your heart. It's a really interesting process to go through. Instead of grief being something that is sort of this amorphous thing and you're not tracking it, and you can actually see the changes in yourself. And so it's a really wonderful thing. And I encourage people, if someone close to you dies, and who among us will not have someone close to us dying, to have some kind of practice that you repeat for a significant amount of time. In Buddhism it's 7 weeks, which is 49 days, and in Judaism it's 11 months. But that you repeat for a significant portion of time you're honoring the person, you're acknowledging the person, and you're also allowing your grief to sort of permute and change as time passes. So it's a wonderful, wonderful practice, and I encourage people to do that when you are in that kind of situation. Thank you very much for your question. Are there any other questions?
I have a question, Judy.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
What's the source of suffering? I've seen it seen as, sometimes they say ignorance and greed, sometimes it says desire or clinging. There's all these different words that are used, and I'm not sure which word I should use when I'm thinking about that.
Yeah, so the notion of the source of suffering? What? There are infinite sources of suffering. Right?
Yeah,
So there's a lot of versions. Like one version is attachment.
oh, yeah, I've heard that one too. Attachment,
We're attached. I forget what were the other things. Desire is a source of
desire, ignorance, greed.
greed, anger, karma. You're suffering in this life because in a past life you did something, something, something. There's also suffering that it's someone else that's causing that suffering, right? Like when those Cossacks broke into my father's childhood home, it wasn't because of anything he and his family did. It was their minds causing the suffering. That's the suffering we have to pay attention to, is the suffering that we cause others. Suffering in some sense it happens, and I don't want to belittle it. But our own suffering, let's not be overwhelmed by our own suffering. Even in our own suffering, we can still look out. We can still see other people. We can still see other beings, not just people, animals, plants, everything. We can see this universe, even in our own suffering, if we look out, you know? So you've all had the experience where you're feeling really crappy and you have some kind of social thing that you have to go to, and you drag yourself to the social thing, whether it's on Zoom or whether it's, in the before times at a bar or whatever, you drag yourself to this social thing, and you kind of forget you're suffering for a minute. You kind of have a good time. You're listening, and it's not like you're having a good, it's like you're paying attention to other people is what's happening. You're paying attention to other people, and your suffering kind of diminishes. Not always. Sometimes you're overwhelmed and you can't, but sometimes it happens. Everyone's had that experience. And then you leave the situation, you close the computer or you leave the gathering or whatever it is, and then suddenly your suffering comes back. Oh, I feel so bad, Everyone's had that experience. So yeah, when we're focused on ourselves and our own suffering, then we have a real problem. And I'm not going to say people don't suffer. I mean, people who die of COVID, that's no way to go. That's absolutely no way to go. And if you've ever seen somebody in the late stages of pneumonia, anything where your breathing is impacted, it's a very difficult way to die. Because our natural thing is to use breath to heal ourselves. Even if you've never heard about pranayama or Zen meditation or anything, our natural thing is to use our breath to heal ourselves, and suddenly that's taken away. That's really hard. So yeah, there's a lot of suffering that goes on in this world that I don't want to pretend it's not there. You think of George Floyd's last moments. I mean, Jesus, that's suffering. But what's the cause of that suffering? The cause of that suffering is that asshole cop, right? It's his own desire, anger, and ignorance that causes that suffering. So what we have to pay attention to is not how to prevent our own suffering, but how to prevent us from causing the suffering of others. That's the real job. It's our desire and anger and ignorance that cause suffering of the people around us. And that's what we have to be really, really careful not to do. So yeah, you can name 100,000, varieties of reasons for suffering, but let's personally not be the cause of others' suffering. And when our own suffering appears, if we can handle it with some kind of grace, to not add to the suffering of others, which doesn't mean downplay it and say, oh, I feel fine. No, that's not saying that. But to acknowledge our own suffering and do it in a way that doesn't add to other people's suffering, not make them feel guilty, not make them feel whatever, That's extremely important. So that's our job, not to add to others' suffering in any way, whatever our particular suffering is. So thank you very much for your question. Are there any other questions? Oh, we're out of time. Look at that. I won't ask for another question. Could you stop recording now?